even in the most darkest scenario, when I really felt that there was really an immense amount of pain and suffering in the world, there was always, in every single scenario, there was somebody who was defying that, who was the healer, who was the helper, who was showing up with compassion and empathy. Those are the lights that I've always looked for in my life and in my work. I know they're always there. And so that's what I take inspiration from. That's who I take inspiration from. The peace builders, the human rights activists, the individuals that, even in the most dire scenarios, are offering compassion or offering understanding.
Where lust for a whole life and nothing but less makes people jump out of a comfortable pond into an unknown ocean. Welcome to that journey between the East and the West. Who says Rolling Stones don't gather moss? Hello, everyone. I am Meenu Gupta, your host for the day, and I'm delighted to have you join me every week as amazing people share their incredible and inspiring life stories of straddling continents. Thank you. Dear listeners, my conversation with Jennifer Freeman continues in the second part of the episode with her as a guest. So it's actually very interesting. Again, the times we're living in, and you mentioned technology. I'm glad you did. How can technology and innovation support peace?
I think that there are many ways that, I mean, technology and innovation are tools. And I think that they are, in some respects, more powerful than any tools that we have previously used, but they are still just tools. And so I think that their ability to support peace and our understanding of one another comes into how they are designed and how they are used. And so the most powerful technology and innovations that I've seen are ones that really are human centric in their design and designed by and with a huge diversity of thought. So we're seeing a lot of digital tools right now being created almost through a crowdsourcing process. You know, AI for large language models are basically scraping incredible amounts of data from a diversity of sources. Now, the problem is that the diversity of sources, you know, the internet's only been around for less than a generation, a couple decades. And so the people who were creating it at the beginning were a very small subset of human beings. So right now, the technology that we're seeing right now is still biased. It's still drawing from knowledge that was created from a small group of people, stereotypically white men in the US and then other countries, you know, as social media platforms and others were generated. But right now, we are seeing digital connectivity, digital access finally starting to democratize much, much, much faster and broader. I work in a space with Peace Geeks where we are designing digital tools for people who've been forcibly displaced, for refugees, for migrants. And one of the challenges I often have to face is when I'm talking to people and they make this assumption that refugees don't have cell phones. They say and think this is very elite technology. And in a lot of ways, you know, access and the ability to have data can be held in a small group of hands. But that is a misconception that people don't have technology. There's been a lot of research in addition to, you know, when I was in refugee camps, there were cell phones around a lot. And they say when people flee, when people forcibly migrate, many have cell phones as their primary technological tool. And even if not everybody in a family or a group has one, often one person will have one and they'll be able to share it with other people. So in studies around asking refugees, do you have access to digital technology, to cell phones specifically? Over 85% of people will say yes, they do, whether their own cell phone or they can borrow a friend's or family members and have access to it. whether or not they always have data, whether or not they always have Wi-Fi or connectivity. Those are actually the kind of infrastructure limitations that people will encounter. But in terms of actually having the technology, a majority of people in the world do. So I think that its ability to, back to your question, how are technology and innovation able to support peace? I think when the tools themselves are created by a diversity of people that can really bring their creativity and needs to bear, then technology has the ability to share information, to connect human beings, to collaborate across borders in a way that when we were restricted without technology, if you can think back to the days before email and the internet and other things, we were limited to where we could physically be and who we could connect with physically or via letters. And now we have the ability to have chats in any language and communicate in ways that I think will truly help people understand the grayness of the world, that people aren't these binary identities, good and bad, Muslim and Jewish or Christian, this nationality and that nationality that ostensibly are, at war with one another. We'll start understanding that we both have kids. We both went to a school where we learned a curriculum, learned art, and we both love it, or poetry, and that we have that in common. And when we find those points of human connection, that sometimes the anonymity of technology can bring out, sometimes just the ability to connect and have a conversation can allow us to do it with somebody that we never would have spoken to before. We had a mentorship program that we ran using a digital platform, and it was doing speed matches. And we worked with corporations in Canada to talk with refugees and newcomers. And most mentorship programs have the goal of getting a job. We were just testing out a theory, testing some hypotheses. So we didn't have everybody must get jobs as an outcome. And so instead, what we did was we matched people not only based on their professional background, but also based on their interests and their lifestyle. We both have kids under 5, or we both like cooking. And the conversations that came out of those resulted in a lot of the employers understanding people better, realizing that the immigrants that they were connected to are phenomenal, smart, intelligent professionals that would fit very well into their company. But when they were just looking at a CV and having all these preconceived notions of who somebody was or who somebody wasn't, they weren't getting there. When they just had a conversation and got to know somebody and got to know their story, then that was leading to breaking down a lot of their preconceived notions. And then, again, people ended up with an unintended consequence from what we were doing of being hired and people being like, this person would be phenomenal. I'd love to have them in my company, on my team.
That's wonderful. So, and I totally agree with you about, again, that's a black and white thing, and people are way beyond their CVs, and a CV doesn't actually justify. And nowadays, it's a worse system, which has also now pretty much in Europe also. Beyond the CVs, the first is a CV, and then you have these set of questions you answer, and based on that, junior, senior, all kinds of positions, because they worked out something that those questions and those particular responses would slotify somebody. And again, it's all actually not on those lines. Everything is actually between the lines that matters. I'm glad you mentioned that. I was going to ask you how, what you mentioned sort of means that this experiment, it was trying to see if you humanize the title of a migrant, a person there. You humanize a person by interacting with who they are and figuring out common interests. Or somebody said wisely when I was talking to an expert in the intercultural field. And when I asked him, what is inclusion? And that's when he had said, finding the commonality in the diversity is inclusion, and accepting that is inclusion. In one line, I found it a fantastic summation, whether it's in the corporate, personal, or whichever sphere. And unfortunately, world leaders are still not doing that. I would not say all. Many world leaders are not doing that. You are working a lot with migration, migrants. Can so many, and when I saw the number of people, it was mind boggling. And I'm very sure this would not even touch the tip of the iceberg in terms of migration. This would be the counted number. Can so many people be migrated in countries? We are seeing an influx across the world based on the rising conflicts. There is forced migration. And therefore, I use the word forced migration because there are that number of migrants who go voluntarily because they see better opportunities somewhere else, or they could have just gone for, they found a partner somewhere else. So it's voluntary migration, and there is this forced migration. So, and forced migration carries with it, beyond the technicality, the whole smell and the aura of migration, the forced part of it. So I'm sure the people who come, it is already very difficult for them to accept that many things because it is being forced to them. They didn't choose. So, having said that, what is your experience in terms of numbers of millions of people? How does it work? And how is it working?
Forced migration is such a complex issue and dynamic around the world because it comes from a lot of different sources. But even just looking at when a natural disaster happens or a conflict happens, and that forced migration has to happen quickly, people are oftentimes forced to move, sometimes with only 24 hours notice. And they often go either within their own country, but to a new place, or across a border. And that's when they become officially a refugee. You know, if it's displacement in the country, it's internally displaced people. But when they get forced across the border, then they're either a refugee if they have a well-founded fear of persecution, or if they, are fleeing for another reason, like natural disaster or conflicts like gang crime in Central America, for example, then they're just considered migrants. One of the dynamics that occur after that is that same phenomena where people are then seeking safety, they're seeking belonging, they're seeking, especially when it's been forced, it's usually because home for them is no longer livable. There's a phenomenal poem by Warsan Shire's Poetry About Home, the British Somali poet. I don't know if you know that poem, but it is an incredibly powerful poem. The first words are, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well." The poem continues. It's many stanzas long, and it's an incredibly powerful story of the desperation that causes somebody to flee. And I feel like if more people understood that, then our societies would be a lot more welcoming to people who've been forcibly displaced. Because if you can empathize with somebody, if you can actually understand living in the safety and security of, a city in Canada like where I am now, or Britain or the US, or so many other places around the world where you have never had to make that choice, then I think that if you could actually empathize with how terrifying and how desperate you feel in that moment to get yourself and your loved ones to safety, I think overall we would have a completely different orientation to people who've been forcibly displaced coming into our communities and giving them more genuine and sustained welcomes. But right now, through a number of different factors and dynamics, the news, people's fears, people's unfamiliarity with the other, with people and cultures, and concerns that they have for whether or not infrastructure and economies can support people who've been forced to flee to other locations, I think that a lot of people are falling into that sense of, just again, coming back to that binary of us and them, and thinking that there are some people that, are welcome to a place, even though across much of the world, many of us, our families or our ancestors moved. I mean, human migration is as old as time. We have always migrated as a human species. And so this idea that if you're born in a place, you have a greater right to it than somebody else is more of kind of a new and very politicized idea. One other thing that I really just wanted to say about these colossal numbers of people who've been forced to move around the world is a lot of times we see migration portrayed as a crisis. So, there are migration crises. We have a migrant crisis. And a number of years ago, I was talking to somebody and they said, what if we flipped that and just started talking about it as an opportunity? Think about how our mindset shifts when we think about what an opportunity we have with this migration. What could 118 million people around the world create when they have a chance to meet each other in different scenarios? Think of all the talent, think of all the ingenuity that can come into our communities, into our businesses, into our government when we have this diversity of thought and perspective that is represented by the global population. So just that mind shift change into a space of imagination, I think, can really give us an opening for what could become possible. Because unfortunately, it's not likely to decrease, even just with the climate crisis that's happening right now, the rate of climate change, rising sea levels, etc. There are a lot of dynamics going on in the world that makes the projections that over the next 5 years, that number of 113 million is likely to increase. So as a global populace, we need to get better at welcoming diversity and understanding how this can be an opportunity and how to be more welcoming to others.
I loved that thought you mentioned that somebody said the mind shift. It changes the whole picture. It puts forth a complete new canvas where you can start jotting down wishes and points and opportunities. That's actually a very beautiful thought. And actually, by the way, those monks don't believe in duality because they say that it arose from oneness when the so-called Big Bang and Maya started. So duality is from where you are seeing it. Well, two sides of a coin. You can either stand on this side or this side, but when you flip it around, it's actually the same coin showing its different faces. So it's very interesting. Now, in all your experiences of conflict and peace building in different situations and countries, is there a commonality that stood out for you when you just look back at all the experiences and just look back as an aerial view?
It sounds cliche, but the commonalities in human beings is so evident when you sit with women and men and girls and boys and look at the dynamics. I mean, culture influences so much. Time and space and history influences so much of the richness of who we are. Language influences our thinking so much. And yet, you know, again, it sounds simplistic, but I think human beings, when, zooming out as far as one can perceive, that concept of oneness, that concept of the fact that really at the end of the day, spiritually, I do believe that there is a connectivity of all living things on this earth. And I have heard and seen over and over and over again, human beings just wanting that sense of belonging, that sense of peace, to the comment that we made earlier. People want to feel safe. They want to feel that they have purpose. They want to feel that they are accepted and that they have value. They have value within themselves and with one another. And when I saw those relationships break down, when I saw human beings not at peace with themselves and with one another, it was often because they did not have that. They did not, that somehow they had lost themselves through shame, through oppression, through violence. They had learned or been taught that they were not worth anything, that they were not worthy in some way. They did not have value as a human being. And so all the way back to what we were saying also around justice and continuity and how we create whole societies and systems that can support one another, I think we really need to reflect on and think about how it is that which human is more human than another? Do we not all have some value? And I think that when we can start out as children, giving value, letting people know that they are heard and understood, I think that is probably the most powerful way to both prevent violence from happening, from people growing up and committing violence, and also the greatest way to see the commonality that we have as an incredibly diverse humanity, incredibly diverse societies, is by just recognizing that each of us all have intrinsic value and something special about one another. I guess that's from very far away. I think that there's so much that we hold common.
So that is so beautiful, Jennifer, because I was going to ask you this a little further down. In my opinion, if compassion, seeing the world as one, managing emotions, as well as non-violent communication was taught in schools, the present and future generation would not have to talk and work so much on diversity and inclusion. We would not be working on the envelope. We would not need to work on the envelope because the core would be developed and would be able to form its own envelope. So what I feel, what we are doing right now in the world is working more and more, and talk more and more on the envelope, while the core is still left unsettled. So somewhere it feels right, we should be doing that, but they have still not addressed the core. And the core comes from very, very young, from family and from schools, essentially. First few years from family and then from schools. But if the same family had also been schooled in a different way, then that family would pass it on to the next gen.
Yes. 100% yes. Remember I told you about my family and growing up in that kind of big tent? My mother studied early childhood education, and she believed very, very strongly that the seed of peace started with how we treat children, how we raise children. And because as a global society, I feel like we are still unlearning and relearning, violence and peace and how to do this. We have so much intergenerational trauma that, cascades down and permeates. And yet there are so many people, I think that you're probably familiar with Pinker's work. Like we are overall as a global society becoming more and more peaceful. We are less violent now than we were at any time in our previous millennia, which is amazing to think about, because with news and the instant communication of information, we perceive that we are more violent, that we are under more threat, that there are more things, but we're not. Like human beings actually interacting with one another are less violent globally than we ever have before. And so I take hope in that. I take a great deal of hope in that. And I see that in ways in which we are learning ways to parent. We are learning methods of nonviolent communication, because I do believe it needs to be learned. It wasn't pervasive in, previous centuries. And overall, again, even if you go down to the level of neuroscience, as human beings, we were able to survive by fearing the other. There was so much, kind of competition around resources. And it is only as we've started building up civilizations that we've realized that we are likely to live longer and be more prosperous as an individual and as your kind of familial ties when we start working cooperatively and together. So to do so, our brains are actually, our amygdalas is, getting overridden by our growing prefrontal cortex. We're becoming more tolerant of diversity. We're becoming more able to recognize the incredible benefits of living in diverse communities. And as we do that, like I said, we're unlearning that fear of the other that we had, and we're moving towards being able to recognize that, as parents, we can parent our children in a way that talks about social and emotional learning. We can parent our societies so that people in all their diversities can show up and be honored and be valued. We can have compassion for more people in their diversity of expression and religion and culture and language and being. And in all of those myriad ways, I think that I actually am very hopeful that we are becoming and have the potential to become a more peaceful global society in the future. But I absolutely believe and agree with you that the core of that is around relearning, learning and relearning what compassion and empathy and how to communicate with one another, what that means for each of us. And yeah, it absolutely starts in families and schools in how we raise children.
Thank you for sharing that. And it gives me hope when you said that, because when I read that report, that since the Cold War, the highest number of conflicts were in 2023, and it's escalating. And you're right, because of digital technology, we are becoming more and more aware of news instantly as it is happening. But what about the numbers? The numbers that the reports show that armed conflicts have actually escalated in different parts of the globe.
Well, I mean, there's a couple different factors that we're seeing. I mean, we're seeing higher numbers of casualties because there are more people on Earth. So when we see, millions and things, so that's one statistic that influences it. And also the nature of wars. So when we are seeing, higher number of wars, how big are those wars? How many people, because we're seeing interstate conflicts, we're seeing small things, what rises to the level, again, depending on what the researchers were considering, a level of violence or a conflict. The research that was done on the fact that we're living in the most peaceful time was to do with how likely a human being was to be the victim of violence, to be killed violently within the course of their life. And again, in the Middle Ages and in centuries of old, it was very, very high. The chance that we would, encounter violence and die from it was very high. So the reports that there are more conflicts and that more people are dying, again, is a little bit due to how those things are being studied, how the researchers are defining each of those. I'm not saying that we should, relax and think that everything's fine. I think that there's so much work that needs to be done and factors driving the conflicts of today, both, again, due to resources and climate change, as well as to do with, long simmering political divisions that are exacerbated for, all the reasons that we know about. But overall, I do think that we are learning how to live peaceably as a majority in the world much, much better than we did before. And I think that work has the potential to continue. Another thread that has gone through our entire conversation is the problems with a single story. In everything that we look at, asking that question, what else? What else is, that's the tip of the iceberg. Where's the complexity under this? Somebody is not just one identity. Who else are they as a human being? That act of violence was not just, probably one person getting mad one day and suddenly doing something like that. What were the threads in their childhood going all the way back that led to their beliefs and reactions that led to that event? And same on the other side. In every single thing, we're not a single story. We're complex.
I totally agree there. But having said that, we spoke about technology. Do you think that human compassion has fallen victim to technological advancement? I've often wondered.
Yeah. And I agree with you very much. I mean, even though I'm in this position right now of being the CEO of a technology nonprofit, for the most part, I'm a tech critic. And I tend to go back to that question of, is technology the right tool for this job or this scenario? And like you, perhaps, I would rather center human connection in, 99% of interactions. I think that, I said before too that I really believe that technology is a tool and we need to remember that and use it as such. And remember that it's not omnipotent. It can't do everything. And the way in which it's being incentivized right now due to capitalism, a global capitalist culture, is to make money, unfortunately, a lot of times. And the process through which it's making money is by keeping eyeballs on it as long as possible. So, like a number of studies and movies have come out, documentaries from The Social Network to a book that was just released recently, The Anxious Generation. I think that there is tremendous data coming out showing the ways in which technology does, as a tool, has a power to suck our attention in. And because that's financially incentivized for corporations, they're making tremendous amounts of money by keeping us focused there. And I do think that that is having a negative consequence.
I agree. So there are two things. As you rightly pointed out, technology is a tool. And it's the same thing that one says you can either use a knife for cutting an apple or you can use a knife for killing a man. When we spoke of the advantages and disadvantages, suddenly it came to mind. One of my guests, I've been speaking to a lot of young people as well, youth leaders and people who've come from war-torn areas as well. And something which was very nice and heartwarming was because I met somebody from the Gaza Strip who had been there during the genocide days as well. He managed to escape. And there was another person who had gone from the Middle East to US. And I remember they told me that for a long while in the Gaza Strip during the genocide, somehow they didn't have access to a network and they were completely in the dark. But suddenly, when some of them started getting access, they realized, a lot of people realized that they were not alone. That there were people out there, when they heard of the protests across the world, in the US and other countries, they realized that they were not alone. And I remember these people saying that when we felt it, we had hope. That there is solidarity in other parts of the world. Just knowing that gave us so much strength. And that day I felt very good for technology. Oh, I was thinking when you were talking about when you think at times while you are working in that company about technology, but what if you marry technology to compassion? In the sense that while you're working with technology, why not also add another field to it of compassion so that it enables the two things simultaneously? Handling technology with compassion, so widening the scope of usage.
I'm fascinated by this. I've been looking into and listening and learning about people who are trying to make AI more empathetic. And that to me is something that makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable when I just hear that phrase, like empathetic AI. I kind of have this reaction like, that empathy should be the purview of human beings. Because I think I fear all the ways in which AI could be manipulated. But I met somebody recently who works in South Africa, and they have developed a platform for LGBTQI plus kids in South Africa. And the person who founded it was himself an LGBTQI youth, a queer youth in South Africa growing up. And he says, he's like, mental health support via technology, it's not always the appropriate medium. But he said, if you just look at the number of counselors that exist in South Africa to support queer youth and the number of queer youth that are out there, it is so hard for the, just the numbers game for people who are struggling to be able to find somebody to talk to not feel so alone. He's created a mental health platform that can now scale, and it's reaching tens of thousands of youth. And he said, that was his entire motivation. He knows it's not ideal. He knows it's just a tool and that a human being would be better. He said, but when you're comparing nothing with something, he's like, that's what I wanted to lean into. I wanted to be able to give. He says, I was in chat forums when I was, an incredibly isolated, bullied youth that was wondering if I should take my own life. And then he said, it was through those chat forums and being connected with somebody else that was going through something similar that gave him that sense of hope that, he wasn't alone. And so now he's using technology to diversify, to democratize that with many other individuals. That's the way in which I feel like technology has that potential, not when it's being used by Facebook or Meta or other platforms to earn incredible revenue and using clickbait and stories that are taking people down these incredibly harmful rabbit holes by the triggering our amygdala, which responds to fight, flight, freeze. So it's these anxiety provoking things that are being incentivized financially for companies. That's the side that I think that we should be cautious of and we need to rethink. But out there are innovators and individuals, many times refugees, immigrants, people that have experienced a problem themselves and are now using technology in new ways to solve that. That's what gives me hope. I find, the ability for compassion. I mean, even in our Welcome to Canada tool, a lot of our tools are designed to try and build connection, give newcomers the information and resources that they need so that they can feel confident and get a sense of familiarity with their new home as fast as possible so that they don't feel alone and desperate and like they don't know where to turn in order to find their feet in a new location. So, technology, it's, as you said, when it has the ability to be married with human feelings such as compassion, connection, empathy, I think it becomes a much more effective tool.
Yes, I think so. And I totally agree and I understand.
Yeah. We often talk about technology development as needing to be adaptive. Again, I'm saying we as in Peace Geeks. So we try and look at which humans is this appropriate for and making sure that there are non-technological options for the human beings for whom technology is not a good solution, does not offer an appropriate pathway, people who lack both digital literacy or even perhaps physical literacy, so reading on the screen and engaging in text might not be appropriate for them. Make sure that there's a human being that can provide that service, but then also be adaptive to when a human being may be able to use technology for many things, but then a certain need that they have isn't best served through technology, such as mental health support, such as also perhaps spiritual connection. That this one thing I can use technology for everything else, but in this one, I want to be adaptive to actually have an in-person experience or to talk with somebody, a human being in real life, as opposed to doing that. And if every technological tool could be adaptive that way, that's what I think our gold standard should be.
I think that's actually putting it very, very nicely. Adaptive technology. I like that. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to be talking to you a lot about many more things. But before that, what is a line of inspiration that you would like to leave the audience behind? Because you mentioned something which was very nice when we talked about the figures and when you said actually it's not like that about the violent conflicts. So that just by saying that, one had the sense and feeling of, oh, there is hope in the world.
Yeah, there is hope in the world. There absolutely is. And as much as I've worked in violence and in conflict, when I look back, what I see is the incredible people working for peace. So even in the darkest scenario, when I really felt that there was really an immense amount of pain and suffering in the world, there was always, in every single scenario, there was somebody who was defying that, who was the healer, who was the helper, who was showing up with compassion and empathy. Those are the lights that I've always looked for in my life and in my work. I know they're always there. And so that's what I take inspiration from. That's who I take inspiration from. The peace builders, the human rights activists, the individuals that even in the most dire scenarios are offering compassion, are offering understanding. And then the only other thing, you can parse this out as you wish, but the other thing that I would say in terms of inspiration is to remember that each of us isn't a single story. And so just to think about all the wonderful complexity that we have as human beings, and then to try and see that in others, to recognize that every single person you're sitting next to at a bus stop, that you're approaching at a coffee counter or anything else has just as many emotions and hopes and dreams and dignity and value as you do. And to me, just kind of going about my day and seeing that in other people reminds me of our connection to one another and my value as well as their value. So that's kind of what I turn to when I need a little spark of hope and inspiration in this world.
I totally agree with you. And that was very beautifully phrased because, as you rightly said, in everyday life, even as strangers, when I meet people, and there's a wonderful connection which develops. I mean, I can tell you stories and stories of just taxi drivers and their lives. They pour out their whole story because they suddenly, feel a human connection. And I'm amazed at the range and what they are coming with and what they are going through. And I think of my people from I don't know how many countries who've laid out their entire lives. Sometimes I remember one of them even wept because at the end of the ride, my taxi had stopped at my house and I wanted to pay up, but I could see that, flow of words. And finally, he wanted to end the conversation and he actually thanked me at the end because he was crying because he suddenly had a human connection. It was a very simple thing, not very complicated. I think each of us is looking for that. It doesn't have to be family and friends. And I think in things and in trees and everything else, we need a connection. So, which we may not have to just buildings at times,
Yeah. And I think that, when we get bombarded with the news and the world seems so dire, I think that it's causing us to pull deeper into ourselves because our brains and our parasympathetic nervous systems were not designed to receive this onslaught of imagery and news and violence, because what we were saying before, the perception is so tilted towards, blood and doom and gloom, that we hear the catastrophic things that are going on in the world. And I think that it causes us to shrink, to be fearful, to pull away, and to think, I can't do anything about this. I can't change it. I can't stop it. I don't know how to deal with it. And it causes us to turn away, to pull back. And so I think that every day reaching out for connection and remembering that that's not the full truth, in any, I'll take Israel and Palestine and the horrific violence going on right there. Whichever side you want to pick, one isn't good and one isn't bad. There's a whole diversity of human beings in those mixes, and every single one of them is as complex and multifaceted as you are. And that, there are people trying to stop the violence on both sides. There are people reaching out and providing, medical aid and hope and connection in all of those scenarios. And so sometimes just talking to your taxi driver, remembering that, smiling at the barista, giving them a compliment, that human connection, that antidote to loneliness and isolation that I think that we fall into, especially when the world seems so on fire and everything seems, I think it's so, so powerful, so important. So thank you, Meenu. It has been wonderful speaking with you today, and I would look forward to doing it again anytime.
Thank you for listening to the series Between the East and the West. Do subscribe to the channels mentioned on the site in case, of course, you liked what you heard. I am Meenu Gupta, the host of the series, and I'll be looking forward to your comments. We love feedback. Thank you once again. Namaste and bye-bye.